So let's have a look at this idea of immutability. Now, objects can either be mutable, which means that you can change them, or they're immutable, which means that you cannot modify the objects. Let's just have a look at what we mean by this, because it is a little bit nuanced, and if we actually break this down a little bit, help us to understand exactly what's going on here. Now, Python is a really good programming language to explore this because some of its objects are mutable and other objects are immutable. Now, mutable objects in Python include lists, and immutable objects in Python include variables. What we're going to do is we're going to use variables to look at examples of immutability and lists to look at examples of mutability. And then we can see and compare how Python or how they behave differently. So let's make a start of this. We're going to start with variables. So we're going to straightforwardly have x equals 3, and then we're going to print that out so we know what's going on there. So we should have 3. And then I'm going to introduce you to a function which you probably haven't come across before, but this is ID. And what this does, it gives you the identification for the object that we've created. So it'll give us the identification for x in this case. Now I'm going to change the value of x then. So x equals x plus 1. So I'm just going to increment it. And again, I'm going to print the value of x. And what I'm going to do then is print again the identification of x. So if I save this and run the program through, what you'll get is getting printing out the value of x, which is 3, which is of course what we've got because that's what we set it to. Then it's giving us the ID for that object, for the object for x, which is that location there, to that ID there. And then we're changing our value of x, and what's happened is now is we've got a different ID value for x. So what's happened is that because our variable is immutable, we haven't actually changed or made any modification to the object that we created initially, to this object here that's with this ID. What we've done is essentially created a new object but given it the same reference of x, and now the ID has changed. So actually, even though we think we've changed the value of x, we haven't, in the sense that the x that we created initially, the object that we stored, is actually the same value. That'll make sense in a slightly later experiment, which I'm going to do. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show now how this differs with a list, which is a mutable object. So let me just copy all that code there, and let's do more or less the analogous situation but with lists. So we're going to set up a list here. So we're going to do x equals 3 there, and we're going to do x, so that's going to be x0 equals x0 plus 1, and then we're going to print out x0, idx, that's fine, and then print out x0. So if we now save this and run the program through, okay, so what you'll notice is that again we've got setting our x to be 3, which is fine, and then we add 1 to it, which gives us 4, so that's fine. But what you'll notice now is the IDs are the same. So even though we've changed the value in our list, the ID is the same. So this means that we've actually been able to change the value. So therefore it's mutable. Okay, so that's the really subtle distinction, I think, between the behavior of a mutable and an immutable object within Python. You don't really notice, unless you dig down as we've just done now, you won't notice what's going on underneath. But this does have consequences, and let's just have a look at how this might play out in terms of consequences for values of other variables. So let's do another little experiment here. So I'm going to start again. In fact, what I'll do is if I copy this code here, copy this down here. So I'm going to do y equals 3 and then just do y equals x. So we're setting y to be x there. We're going to do print the ID of x, and then we're going to print the ID of y. Let's print those out, copy that out. So we've got those two. And then we're going to print out, we'll just print out the value of y anyway, just so you can see what's going on there. And then we'll add one to that, and then we'll print out the ID for x. And then what we'll do is we'll also print out y as well. And we'll also print out, so print out x, and we'll also print out the value of y. I'm going to comment out all this code at the top here, the previous experiments that we've been doing. Format, comment, and let's run this and see what we get. So save it and run. Okay, so we've got x equals 3, y equals x, and if you notice when we print out the ID of x and y, they're both exactly the same as you'd expect, because we set y to be x, so that's what we'd expect. Print out the value of y, which is 3. Again, nothing unusual or what we don't expect there. We add 1 to x, so again 4, we'd expect that. And then we print out y, but that remains as 3. So even though the value of x has now changed, y remains the same, because this y is referring to the original ID, object ID here. Whereas the new object ID we've created, because we changed the value of x, we had to create a new object of for x, and so therefore, in this case, it's actually changed the value of x, but not changed the value of y. So this is where you have to be really careful in understanding this idea of immutability. Again, I'm going to do this experiment again, but now I'm going to do it with lists which are mutable, and let's see how this behaves differently. So again, I'm going to comment out this, so it's just easier to follow the output when we do that. So we're going to do x equals 3 there, y equals x, we keep those the same, print y 0, x 0 equals, x 0, so we can do print out x 0, y 0. So let's just see what's going on with that. So exactly the same code, except now we're doing lists instead of variables. Let's run it. And we can see that, again, our ID is the same at the top there, as you'd expect. We print out the value of y, which is 3. Yeah, we add 1 to it, and that's the value of x. And now the value of y is also the same, so that's changed, and that's because we've actually changed the object, the value of the object. We've been able to do that because it's a mutable object, and therefore the value of y is also changed because that's linking to the same object ID, and you can see that by looking at the two, or the bottom row here, which is the ID for y, even though that stayed the same, and for x as well, it stayed the same as well. So we can see there, hopefully, you can see that it's really important to know this distinction between immutability and mutability, because the behavior can be really different, and if you've ever come across this problem before, then it could well be a lack of understanding of this idea of immutability and mutability.